Here's one of my all-time favorite blending modes. I come to it frequently for all sorts of things. That is the Darken mode, Multiply. Now, I've heard this described as the same effect of placing two transparencies on top of each other on a light table, which doesn't apply so much in the real world, as fewer people have light tables, which is just a table with either a glass or plastic on the top and a light bulb below it, so that when you have an image placed on top of it, you can put a piece of paper or another image or what have you above it, and you can do artwork with it. And one way you can do that is with tracing. Another thing you can do is take transparencies, that is plastics with prints on them, or plastics that have been altered to have color on them in some way, or even slides from slide projectors, which many of you probably haven't seen the slide projector in person. So it's not as useful a description as it used to be, but Multiply is a fairly simple algorithm, which is to say the process for handling it is as easy as A, X, B. And this is perhaps the smallest font I could have possibly selected, so let me crank that up for you real quick. And what this means is your active layer is simply multiplied with the layer below it. And this is a composite style situation. It's not doing anything strange on a channel by channel basis. It simply takes a look at what you have and then multiplies it below. Now keep in mind that we went over a long video explaining this, but these are standardized, so the multiplication process doesn't result in brighter colors, such as say you have a value of 200 luminosity and another value of 10 luminosity. You don't end up with a value of 2000, which you would if you normally multiplied it. They're first converted into percentages through division, and then they're multiplied together. So it in fact has a darkening effect. But what does this mean? Why is that important? It means that you're not going to clip anything to black, so you don't lose any data going in here. If there is already black in it, then that's what you're going to see, because that was already black. You're not, but if you have something that wasn't black multiplied together with something else that's not black, it's not going to go to black, because multiplying two non-zero numbers together doesn't result in zero. That's all that there is to it. It's impossible to do. So that makes it a beautiful effect for most things that you need to do. In fact, if we were to come over here to this tiger and this lady, and we just threw the tiger into multiply mode, we immediately get this beautiful blending occurring. Multiply is just an absolutely gorgeous way to affect images. And of course, multiply is also an adjustment that will knock out white. So if we simply set something to multiply, then voila, the white simply vanishes. And that's only true for pure white. If you have absolute white, it's gone. That makes it perfect, absolutely perfect for working with line art. It's an amazing blending mode for all sorts of things. There is something else about Multiply that's quite important, although I doubt that it will be demonstrated well with these images. It is one of the 8 blending modes that is affected differently between opacity and fill opacity. So let me explain how this works. In the event of opacity, you're simply decreasing the image, right? The opacity decreases, the transparency increases, so there's less and less image. But with the fill opacity, what this will do is decrease the amount of the effect that's occurring. And unfortunately, it's very subtle here. We'll be able to see a much bigger difference when we get down to the hard mix going in, but that's a ways away. So let me just demonstrate it real quick. So there are 8 blending modes that will be affected differently from fill opacity than it will from standard opacity. And you might want to write this down because they're pretty important. Multiply, color burn, linear burn, color dodge, linear dodge add, vivid light, linear light, hard mix, and difference. Those 8 are affected differently according to the fill opacity. So for just a minute, let's skip way far ahead to hard mix and what that is doing. Hard mix is an interesting process. It will essentially, my understanding is that it's similar to a threshold effect being passed on these. And if you recall, that means it's either black or white. And that means that you're reducing these, since there are no grays on any of these three channels, a threshold effect is being passed on each of the three channels. You're ending up with only 8 possible colors, which are the cyan, magenta, and yellow, blue, red, and green, along with black and white, which in other words is the primary and secondary colors of the additive color system, our light system, along with black and white. So you can see that this is a very strong effect, and quite frequently one that you're not going to want at full power. But by simply lowering the opacity, you can see that I'm just having less of the image, but the effect is still just as strong. By lowering the fill opacity instead, we have the effect toned down, but the opacity of the layer is being toned down as that effect is toned down. However, you can see quite the difference. Let's say that we have a fill opacity of 50 as compared to an opacity of 50. So again, fill opacity is less of the effect. The effect is being faded away. And we can see this most clearly on the channels. As I adjust the fill opacity, you can see that the effect is becoming more or less pronounced. Let's go ahead and really crank that up. See? Whereas if I were just working on opacity, you can see that the threshold effect that's occurring on the topmost layer, the lady with the umbrella, is still present. It's simply fading away to reveal the hands below. And as it fades away, yes, the hands below have less of the effect being applied to it, but the active layer, if you wanted that effect to be reduced, you would have to use fill opacity. Frequently, fill opacity will be the one that you'll want to use on a layer that is simply being used as a blending mode. And that's also true if you're using an adjustment layer that exists only to do an adjustment. Fill opacity will be the get-go. Now, a question that I'm asked is, why have 2? Why not just use 1? Well, clearly there are many times that you'll want to do a different opacity as compared to a fill opacity. But that doesn't answer the question. Why not just make it smart, and on the 8 layers that are affected by it, affect it just that one time, just have this disappear on any of the other non-8 layers? And the answer is, as far as I can tell, when they programmed this, they didn't want it appearing and disappearing and then toggling the adjustment. It would have to decide, well, did they want the fill opacity down because they're doing an opacity adjustment? Well, so should we keep that down here, up there? They were having to make too many decisions for the user. Just by having 2 of these, simplifies all of the code. They don't have to make decisions. It behaves the same way for everyone all the time. So that's my understanding of it. Now, there are times that you'll see an opacity option on a dialog box or a pop-up, one of those guys, and it will generally be the fill opacity instead of the standard opacity. So let me demonstrate that real quick. Just pop back over here. We'll do a filter, blur, Gaussian blur. We'll just crank that up a lot, right? So we're set. So if we go to edit, fade Gaussian blur, this opacity is actually a fill opacity, and I can prove that. I'll just go over to hard mix, and as I drop it, you can see that the effect is fading as well as the opacity. Now, if I were on something like normal mode and just dropped it, we wouldn't be able to really notice the difference. It just looks as though it's fading back. It's when we start blending it with the modes. So frequently, these will be a fill opacity, not a standard opacity. So just a heads up on that as we go through. All right, so that is multiply. Tune in for the next video. We're going to cover the color burn and the linear burn and what the difference are between those two. See you in a minute.